The World Affairs Council of Greater Reading is the leading educational organization promoting understanding and enlightenment on global issues. We are back once again for another Great Decisions presentation. We're really happy to be able to bring these to you. My name is Mike. I'll be your host and moderator for the afternoon. And we're gonna watch the Great Decisions video on climate change. And then we'll introduce the president of the World Affairs Council of Greater Reading to introduce our speaker, Dr. Stober. We are gonna be talking about climate change today. Submit any questions you have via chat. We'll take questions from World Affairs Council members through chat on Zoom. And certainly if you're joining us by Facebook, you can leave your comments there too. And if we're able to work them in, we will. I do have everybody muted as they come into the meeting. We'll keep everybody muted. So predominantly rely on chat for your questions, but if you want to join us live, you can get my attention either through chat or that's probably the best way. So let me get started with the video here. Share.
Around the world, sea levels are on the rise. By the end of this century, hundreds of millions of people, more than the current population of the United States, could be displaced from their homes. In the Indian Ocean, in the South Pacific, and in the Caribbean, entire countries are under threat. Great Decisions investigates what can be done to prepare for the climate crisis on the horizon. Rising tide, climate change, and the world's oceans. Next on Great Decisions.
Great Decisions is produced by the Foreign Policy Association in association with Thomson Reuters. Funding for Great Decisions is provided by PricewaterhouseCoopers LLP and the Nelson B. Delavan Foundation.
The iconic images of global climate change show the retreat of glaciers and the melting of the polar ice caps. But the reasons for sea level rise are diverse and complex.
There are two major factors that contribute to rising sea levels. One is simply that warmer water takes up more volume. The second biggie is ice melting off land.
There's a whole array of projections for the end of the century, but some of them go up to as much as 2 meters. The most optimistic projections are only 1 meter. Another major unknown is the rate at which the West Antarctic ice sheet and the Greenland ice sheet will melt.
The climate is changing. It's clear that human activity is playing a role. I think some of the projections of catastrophic warming aren't born in the data. They're based on scenarios that are unlikely to become true. In that regard, yes, we can talk about climate change and the costs and the benefits of a warming world, but at the same time, the fear-mongering is almost just as disingenuous as saying global warming is a hoax.
Climate change is real and it's caused by human behavior. Our use of fossil fuels and carbon emissions is adding to the warming of the Earth.
The gradual rise in temperatures and sea levels are closely linked to the severity of extreme weather. The accumulation of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere poses a global problem, which no one country can address alone.
The Nobel laureate Bill Nordhaus has put forward some helpful figures. What he's identified is very clearly is that we've moved from a situation where temperatures have risen significantly more in the last few centuries than they did for the last 650,000 years. So the implication is that if we reduce or pivot some of these human-led activities, that you would therefore see a reduction in emissions, and therefore you would see at least a reduction in the degree to which the temperature around the world is actually rising.
We know to achieve the ultimate goal of certainly keeping warming below 2 degrees centigrade, that's going to require upping the ante beyond that 10 or 15-year time period. We're talking about certainly the industrialized countries like the United States looking at 80% kinds of reductions by mid-century.
It's the consensus of the models in this area that a 2-degree target is, at this point, getting very, very difficult to meet, even with maximum efforts. Some of the modeling that's been done in this area would suggest carbon taxes in the $500 to $1,000 or even higher dollars per ton of CO2.
Even if the United States were to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions down to zero or achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions, the climate models project that we would only mitigate global temperatures a few tenths of a degree Celsius by the year 2100, and we would maybe avert a few centimeters of sea level rise over that same time period.
The Paris Agreement, negotiated by 196 countries in 2015, was intended to provide a framework for more ambitious global emissions reduction targets. In 2017, President Donald Trump announced the United States' intention to withdraw from the accord.
What I think this administration saw is that the Paris Accord would have significant cost to the American economy in terms of the policies that would increase the cost of energy and drive out attempts to produce coal, oil, and natural gas in the United States and shift those activities elsewhere.
One country by itself will make essentially no difference to whether it's sea level rise or other impacts of climate change, because they're only a small fraction of the emissions. So what's really damaging about the Trump policies is that it slows this very difficult process of reaching international consensus and after that, an international agreement.
It would be nice to have a Paris Accord, but one that holds all the countries equally responsible. My problems with Kyoto and Paris weren't the goals. The goals are great. The problem is that they kind of cut Russia and China a break, which I don't think's totally fair to the developed nations like the United States and Europe.
The United States got all of the benefits of our polluting days as we rose to an industrial giant. And now we're in the position of telling countries like China and India that they should forsake that benefit that the United States got, unregulated carbon pollution, simply because the crisis is here and now.
The rationale for the withdrawal from the accord remains hotly debated in Washington.
What disturbs me about it is that I think he's done it mainly to placate the coal-producing constituency here in the United States. More specifically, he's concerned about the states of West Virginia and Kentucky. And I think that's an unfortunate way to make these kinds of decisions.
I was in the White House Situation Room on the day after the withdrawal from the Paris Climate Accord happened. I take it as basically a box-checking exercise that was something that wasn't done with a lot of regard for the long-term consequences of future generations of our country or the planet.
Domestic politics. There's no rational reason to withdraw from the Paris Agreement that every single other country in the world is in, other than the fact that, Trump wanted to kind of provoke liberals, I guess, take a shot at Obama and signal to the fossil fuel industry that they're going to be able to do whatever they want. Is the worst kind of political calculation.
Now, opinions among American legislators are divided about whether it makes sense for the United States to rejoin the Paris Agreement.
You've got a whole range of ideologies here behind opposition to talking about climate change. You have the deniers or the hoaxers or whatever they call them. You have the people that agree that there is climate change, but they don't think man's had as much to do with it as the IPCC or the Intergovernmental Study suggest. And then there are people that agree that, man has had a role, and climate cycles probably have a role too, and we should address what we can. We can't stop climate cycles, but we can deal with man's part.
The United States can't preach temperance from a bar stool. We can't tell the rest of the world to do something about climate when we ourselves have pulled out of the Paris Climate Agreement. The American public gets it. The polling shows that there's been a dramatic increase in the acceptance of climate change being real and the need to do something about it. The problem really is in the White House, where the president refuses to accept the science and to
accept the responsibility of dealing with the consequences of what the science is telling us.
For the Earth's lowest-lying countries, the problems posed by climate change are more urgent.
The largest number of people vulnerable to climate migration is in Bangladesh. It's a very low-lying country. There are tens of millions of people who are in real danger of having to move, particularly given the political and ethnic and religious tensions in that part of the world.
Whether and how dramatic this is going to be, no one can be absolutely certain. But I think there's some countries, the smaller ones, like some of these South Pacific islands, have actually thought about, well, you know, maybe we have to move quite a bit of our assets to some other part of the world, and there might be a time when our populations would actually have to be transplanted.
Several nations in the South Pacific have already chosen to evacuate islands that are facing particularly grave threats.
Governments have already relocated entire populations within their national borders. So governments in both the Pacific and the Caribbean have already relocated communities into areas that are safer for them to live.
In most of the small island states that are endangered by sea level rise, there is not overt discussion of moving, of fleeing. It tends to be politically unacceptable in those countries. They really want to stay where they've been for thousands of years.
As the sea levels rise, low-lying nations face difficult choices about how to prepare. Some countries, like Kiribati, are already making plans to relocate their populations.
Kiribati, which is a Pacific country, has already purchased land in Fiji with the idea of relocating its entire population. Dominica, which is a Caribbean island, pledged to become the first climate-resilient nation in the world after it was devastated by Hurricane Maria in 2017. It's planning to take massive infrastructural changes like elevating bridges, burying utility cables.
Well, a former administration of Kiribati bought land in Fiji, purportedly for farming, but most people thought also to move some portion of their population. The later administration rejected that idea. But Kiribati is one of the countries that is in most danger of being submerged eventually as a result of climate change.
Other countries favor a different approach, using engineering to fight back against rising seas. This approach often requires significant investment.
There are two basic strategies to the rising seas. One is protect, and the other is retreat. So, for example, if you have a very large city, such as New York, extremely valuable, lots of valuable real estate, it would be unthinkable for us to let New York just gradually become inundated. So I think for New York, you'd say, well, let's figure out a way to protect it by seawalls and barriers, and there are various kinds of mechanisms to do that.
You had a tremendous flood in 1953 in the Netherlands that killed over 2,000 people, over 30,000 animals, inundated nearly 10% of the entire country. And so you will hear people say, well, you know, the Netherlands has spent over $50 billion since 1953 in order to address North Sea and other flood-related issues. And that's certainly a tremendous amount of money over a 60-plus year period of time. But for the Dutch, it's a matter of national survival.
The most disruptive consequence of sea level rise could be the displacement of hundreds of millions of refugees from low-lying areas.
Almost no countries have agreed to take in people who are displaced by climate change. There are a few very small bilateral agreements that provide for that.
When most people think of islands and the impacts that climate change will have on islands and low-lying nations, they think that these countries will be completely submerged underwater. But long before that happens, many islands will become uninhabitable because of other effects of sea level rise. So, for example, sea level rise causes saltwater intrusion, It causes soil salinization, and this affects people's access to fresh water and to food.
Local political infrastructures are simply not ready for the very quick tsunami of population migration that comes as the land that they can farm changes literally under their feet.
Currently, international law does not offer any recognized status to those who are forced to leave their homes on account of climate change.
Because we succeeded after World War II in defining a refugee in the 1951 Convention. Revising that, opening up the rights of asylum, refugee status, is going to be a real challenge.
The international community has made strides to try to address this problem. Recently, almost 200 countries adopted the Global Compact for safe, orderly, and regular migration. And this compact is the first international agreement on migration and recognizes that climate change is a reason that people move, and that as a global community, we need to be addressing this issue.
The great point that I would make is that in the attempt to try to address those who are forced to flee their country as a result of climate change, we don't end up undermining the position of those who are forced to flee as a result of violence or political conflict.
There's quite a debate about whether the definition of refugee should be changed. One grounds for opposition to it is that the number of people who are displaced by climate change would overwhelm the system. It's far more than the number of people who are displaced by what's conventionally thought of as persecution.
While vulnerable populations in poorer countries will feel severe impacts from climate change first, advanced economies are not immune to the effects.
The United States is probably the most heavily affected by large storms of any large country. Hurricanes are generated by warm water, and they're fed by warm water. As the water gets warmer, then you're likely to have more severe hurricanes, and that means more intense hurricanes.
Many advanced economies have coastal communities and cities. New York, for example, is a coastal city. In the US, scientists report that over 300,000 homes valued at collectively over $100 billion are at risk of being completely flooded by 2045.
I mean, if you pick the same level of protection that the Dutch have, out of necessity, it's $50 billion for every 250 miles of coastline.
Another thing we can do is look at some of the resiliency infrastructure ideas that are being talked about, like deep injection wells, berms, seawalls, things like that. They're trying some of that in Miami Beach right now to deal with the rising sea levels.
There are calls to look beyond renewable energy sources to address the problem more quickly, as the cost of inaction to global productivity could be daunting.
Let's take 3 degrees C, where the numbers have been pretty carefully gone over. At the point where we cross the 3-degree mark, it can cost 2 to 5% of world output, and rising very sharply as temperature rises after that.
We actually have a form of dense energy that can be made quite safe, emits virtually nothing, and could power an extremely large portion of our society, and that is nuclear fission. The new reactor designs are considered pretty fail-safe. If people fear global warming, but somehow fear nuclear power more, I question their seriousness on the issue.
There's no mention of something like nuclear power, which is by far the largest source of emissions-free electricity that we have on this planet and can provide a lot of baseload power. And one would think that if you are really worried about the existential threat that climate change could pose, you would want to build all the nuclear you can get.
Some experts have argued that the ongoing migration crises in Europe and the Western Hemisphere are opportunities for richer nations to learn how to manage the even larger flows of migrants that climate change might trigger.
The influx of migrants that happened in 2015 was a great wake-up call to many of the politicians in the European Union that you may have a goodwill to be able to bring migrants into a society, but that this needs to be calibrated with regard to thinking about the social security system to be able to support this, the welfare system to be able to support this, as well as the educational and growth opportunities going forward, the convertibility of skills, the retraining of skills.
The lessons are not yet being learned. There is an enormous temptation on the part of the richer countries to ignore problems until they are overwhelming. And all of our experience at the International Rescue Committee is that the sooner you address the position of refugees, the sooner you integrate them into society, the greater their chances of success.
Think of the strengthening of Orban's government in Hungary. Think of the strengthening of right-wing parties in France. And think, of course, of Brexit, all driven heavily by, not just, but heavily by migration concerns. So we've entered a period of political populist pushback against refugees and migrants. And the politics of all of this is very challenging.
In the United States, one plan to address climate change has been nicknamed the Green New Deal.
The Green New Deal is a set of principles and a resolution. It's not a bill, and it's 4 basic points when it comes to energy. One is we have a very large problem. Second of all, we have to respond with a very robust solution. Third, we'll create millions of jobs as we rebuild our energy economy. And fourth, we can direct a lot of those jobs to places that really need them, including former fossil fuel communities, to frontline urban communities that have been bypassed before, and to rural and frontier communities.
There's some very nice aspirational goals in there, no doubt about it. I don't know that I see it as a structurally complete package of how to get there. That's why I'm focusing on some real tangible things, like the resolution about sea level rise, like the carbon tax, like pushing to ban offshore drilling in the Eastern Gulf.
We've become the world's leading producer in natural gas and in oil. What the Green New Deal attempts to do is tax and regulate and mandate that affordable, reliable energy out of existence. And that's going to have cataclysmic economic effects on this economy.
There are millions of jobs to be had in renewable energy technology and solar panel construction and wind turbine development and advanced battery technology. And if the United States doesn't create a domestic market for those technologies, then those companies are going to continue to grow in places like China and India and Europe, where there are domestic markets for renewable energy. So, I just don't buy this idea that a big investment in renewable energy in this country is expensive. What's expensive is not creating a domestic market for renewable energy.
In less developed countries, large-scale development projects to address climate change bring economic challenges. The Green Climate Fund was designed to address this issue.
The Green Climate Fund was established by the United Nations as a sort of a bank to take in money from the developed countries that would be used to assist in the climate mitigation and adaptation measures of the developing countries.
What we said as a consortium of more advanced economies, the US, Europe, Japan, and others, is we will create a fund that will be available to help poorer countries skip over the dirtier forms of energy like coal and develop clean, renewable sources of energy. One of the things I remember in the very last days of the Obama administration is we just kind of went around knowing that Trump was going to take aim at this. How can we commit as much money to this as possible? And ended up with kind of several $1 billion as a US commitment. Trump, of course, has walked away from this, pulled back.
The fact that the U.S. pledged $3 billion and only gave $1 billion during President Obama's administration was, again, a step in the right direction, but not adequate. The fact that we've given nothing since that point to this vital fund is a sad commentary on our unwillingness to recognize the global responsibilities that exist to deal with the threat of climate warming.
At the heart of the climate change issue is the question of what richer countries owe to the world's most fragile nations.
First and foremost, I think we need to continue to promote policies that increase economic growth in the developing world. And part of that is ensuring they have access to affordable, reliable power, because it's when countries have a significant level of income that they start to care about the environment and consequently will care about climate change.
My view is that the first step that countries have to take is to raise the price of carbon, raise the price of CO2 emissions. That will solve a lot of the issues that need to be solved.
We cannot have our actions create catastrophic conditions for vulnerable people around the world and then turn a blind eye to the impact that we have created and the moral responsibility that we have to reach out our hands to help.
I think it's incumbent on countries like our own and others like the Dutch who have studied these problems ad infinitum to share our knowledge and capabilities with the world.
How well we can prepare will be a kind of a judgment on us in the human story. We knew, have we gotten prepared? How well of a job have we done? We'll see how we do in the human story.
The gradual rise in sea levels and increasingly severe storms are a crisis in slow motion. Like all mammals, humanity is superbly adapted to deal with immediate threats, but far less capable of tackling long-term challenges. With so much potential to reshape how nations interact with one another, climate change and rising seas may force the world to recognize that the decisions made today will be felt for generations to come.
Great Decisions is America's largest discussion program on global affairs. Discussion groups meet in community centers, libraries, places of worship, and homes across the country to discuss global issues with their community. Participants read the 8-topic briefing book, meet to discuss each topic, and complete a ballot, which shares their views with Congress. To start or join a discussion group in your community, visit fpa.org or call 1-800-477-5836. Great Decisions is produced by the Foreign Policy Association in association with Thomson Reuters. Funding for Great Decisions is provided by PricewaterhouseCoopers LLP and the Nelson B. Delavan Foundation.
Through the end of the video, I want to once again thank the Foreign Policy Association for allowing us to use these videos. This is our third presentation in the Great Decision series that the World Affairs Council of Greater Reading is bringing to you virtually. I want to especially thank the now more than 45 people who are joining us, members on Zoom and also through Facebook Live. This has been a great experience. We've had great interest in it. And I will just remind you also that this is the third in our series. If you want to see the earlier videos or anything that comes after this, you can do so on our Facebook and YouTube channels, facebook.com/WACReading and youtube.com/WACReading. We will make those recordings available and keep them there. And to keep the meeting going, I'm going to bring on the president of our World Affairs Council of Greater Reading, Ms. Lynn Brown.
Thanks, Mike, and welcome everyone. Glad to have you with us today. Let me introduce Dr. Stober. He's a professor of biology at Alvernia University. He's taught biology for 30 years, including undergraduate courses in genetics, botany, and environmental science. Since earning his doctorate at Temple with a specialization in educational leadership and policy studies, he teaches graduate courses in leadership and supervises dissertations. In 2005, he received Alvernia's Christian R. and Mary F. Lindback Foundation Award for Excellence in Teaching, and he was awarded a professorship in 2011. He's also served in several key administrative positions at Alvernia, including department chairman, PhD program director, Dean of Arts and Sciences, Dean of Graduate and Continuing Studies. Dr. Stober is an advisory member for the International On Sustainability Research Network. His work on environmental, cultural, and socioeconomic sustainability has enabled him to travel to universities in countries like Chile, Japan, Croatia, Malaysia, India, Ecuador, Denmark, Vietnam, Brazil, and New Zealand. He is co-authoring a book, or has co-authored a book with Dr. Donna Yari, Associate Professor of Theology at Alvernia University, entitled God, Science, and Designer Genes, an exploration of emerging issues in genetic technologies, published in 2009. Dr. Stober, thanks so much for being with us today. We'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, everyone. Before I get started, let me just share my screen so that we can
be prepared here. Now, for those of you who do not, just a technical issue first, for those of you who do not want to have my picture blocking it, I believe if you go up to your top of your screen, there'll be a place where you can select side-by-side view, or else you can just sort of click me out of the way. First, I'd like to begin by thanking the World Affairs Council, and thank you, Lynn, for that introduction. I would like to thank the World Affairs Council and everyone for what you're doing for the community and for the global community. And also, I want to thank everyone for attending, because I see a lot of familiar faces out there, and thank you very much. I'm going to talk about climate change. I'm going to begin with a little more of the science behind it, because I think if we don't understand the science, we can't really understand the magnitude of the problem. I'll mention some of the things in the film, but I think the film is excellent. The focus on carbon and sea level rise is only a part of a really large problem. So first of all, when I use the word we, I'm talking about our species, all of humanity. I'm not just talking about the US or one country. I'm talking about everyone, for our species as a whole. I noticed in that video, they had a picture of, they had this picture, but it was not, they didn't run it through. So I have a 1-minute clip. It's only 1 minute long, no sound. And in the upper left corner, you'll see there's a color code. Generally, it's 2 degrees C is reddish above normal, and the bluish color is 2 degrees below normal. And this is deviation from average normal temperature. In the upper right of the screen, it has the years, starting with 1880 to 1884. This was all data that was recorded and managed by NASA. Well, actually, NASA was not in existence at that point, but data that was available, and assembled this particular chart. So I'm going to start it, run it for 1 minute, and take a good look at the way the colors are laying out as it is now. 1890, 1900, 1910, 20, 1930, 1940, 1950, 1960, 1970, 1980, 1990, or now we're 2000. And here we are to 2017. There's a clear indication that the planet is getting warmer. Now, cycles are natural. I can't argue with that. But we need to talk a bit about the science. And I have my friend, the baby orangutan. It's going to every once in a while ask me a question. And first of all, he says, humans are in a tight spot. Their problem has become my problem. What is the science behind this situation? Now, to illustrate, I have a couple slides that I'm going to use and build the point. This represents the biosphere, and all that green in the middle, the tree, represents all of the life on Earth. We happen to just be lucky enough to live on a Goldilocks planet. That's a planet that's the right distance from a sun in its solar system, that we aren't too hot but not too cold, and we have the right amount of mass so we hold an atmosphere. And holding that atmosphere is essential because the sun comes in, it heats the area, and then as it heats the area, infrared waves move up. Some of the waves bounce off the greenhouse effect, that is the gases in the atmosphere, and they keep the Earth warm, and a lot of the radiation goes out. And this cycle has been around for a long time. The sun also comes in and drives photosynthesis, which is part of a larger carbon cycle, which keeps the entire Earth in a balance. Now, there are lots of geocycles, which obviously this is like a whole 2-3 semester talk in one little slide. But as this is now, this is natural. But the minute we humans started to take fossil fuels out of the ground, we were taking carbon that was captured by photosynthesis and ultimately became fossil fuel from the past. And we're outgassing it, and we're getting ancient sunlight for energy, and we're getting carbon in the atmosphere. So essentially what we're doing is we are overloading By burning those fuels, we're overloading the modern day carbon cycle. And because of that, we get excess GHGs, or greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide being one, and then that traps more heat. So we're building the thermal blanket around the Earth. The greenhouse effect is even becoming greater, and the Earth is overheating. And it's primarily from burning the fossil fuels. Now, there are other factors as well. So there's absolutely little doubt that we're overloading the modern day carbon cycle. This video focuses on, the result of sea level rise and so on, but I think there's even a bigger point that's being missed across the board. And on the left of your screen, I write loss of ecosystem services. The global ecosystem is finally balanced after years of evolution to basically recycle waste and produce energy, and the system is in balance. For example, if I take a banana peel and I throw the banana peel in the trash, then the banana peel gets into the landfill, decomposes and produces methane, another greenhouse gas. If I'm walking in the woods and I throw the banana peel in the ground, it gets absorbed and into the ecosystem and into the cycle of life, and it doesn't release as much carbon. So waste is the big issue. And carbon dioxide in excess can become a waste, even though carbon dioxide is necessary for the functioning of the natural carbon cycle. Now, there's another thing we need to consider. Well, before I go on to the carrying capacity, let's just list the gases just so we know what we're talking about. Most of the greenhouse gas we're concerned about is carbon dioxide. Of course, there's methane, halogenated gases, nitrous oxide. But we usually focus on carbon dioxide, methane in our discussions. Most of the carbon dioxide ends up and remains in the atmosphere. Some's absorbed by the oceans, where it can be part of the carbon cycle and also become part of the photosynthetic cycle, and some of it remains in the land. Methane comes from natural sources. It naturally comes, as our permafrost melt, which is not a natural thing, but as they melt, they release methane, which is decomposition of organic matter in those areas that didn't happen while it was frozen. The anthropogenic sources would be intensive farming, where we have lots of flatulence from animals and so on. So the gas composition, for us to deal with this, we need to address all the gases, but carbon dioxide is actually carbon dioxide, methane are some that we're pretty easy at addressing. The halogenated fluorocarbons, we worked with that years ago when we tried to reduce the greenhouse or the ozone layer problem. Now, there's another point I need to make before I get to how we can address this issue, and I'm going to start with two axes, an X and a Y. On the bottom, I'm going to put time. And on the right, I'm going to put population size. And I'm going to do this in an idealized sense. Think of a fish aquarium. And I could use a natural system as an example, but the fish aquarium is a quick and easy model. A fish aquarium can hold a certain number of fish before you exceed its capacity. So the population of fish can grow till you reach the carrying capacity. Now, you could put a really good filtration system and remove waste. You could do lots of different things and make it that your fish aquarium could carry more fish and the population can go up. Now, if we take the same growth idea to human populations, when we were hunters and gatherers, we were down in this area. And when we exploited an area, we just picked up our things and went to another area. But as we developed agriculture and different kinds of systems of technology, we were able to take that carrying capacity and put it up higher. And most recently, we've really put the carrying capacity up high so that we can carry a lot of people on Earth. Now, the problem is, by estimates, we actually have more persons on the Earth than the Earth could support by itself by a half of an Earth. And we did this push. We raised this carrying capacity, this extra half, by the fossil fuels providing us the energy and technologies as well. So the challenge will be is how can we convert from a fossil fuel economy that got us up to here to a green economy, which is not going to produce all the waste, carbon dioxide, and overload our systems. Now let's look at a few more facts. This graph is from NASA again, and it goes back to 800,000 years ago, and you might say, well, how could you measure the CO2 800,000 years ago? We do it by core samplings and looking at the atmosphere. So this is a projection, and it stayed below this level around 300 parts per million up to around 1950, and all of a sudden you got this big spike. And right now, not today, but a few weeks before COVID, we were at 413 parts per million. So let's just explore this part of the graph a little bit more, because this is our recent times. That's just a citation. Here we go. We split this graph again. This again is from NASA. 2007, 380 parts per million, steady increase. Now they took the seasonal fluctuations out of this graph, and here we are today at 413. But I have to really correct myself because we're living in an era of COVID. Now, because of COVID, we estimate that the amount of carbon is down about 17% in the atmosphere. Now, in order to achieve, that's down around 340. Now, we didn't, we're actually before this level in 2007, which is amazing. Now, also, the reason that's not on this graph is because the actual carbon dioxide levels are only really officially announced once a year. So this is strictly at this point just an estimate. Plus, this is probably not going to hold. We'll be back to carbon emission as usual, probably, if the COVID pandemic subsides. Looking at China during the shelter in place, the first one on the left is nitrous oxide emissions, January 1 to 20, and then this is on the right, the satellite image. So there is clear evidence that there's a relationship between greenhouse gases and economies. But I do want to just talk a bit about China and the US, because we are two of the largest emitters. What's interesting is the US, and this is World Bank data, actually is about 16.5 metric tons of CO2 per person. China is only 7.5 per person, but that's because China has a lot more people. So if we look at it this way, this is emissions, this is the country, and in 1960, this was China, US, India, and then in 2017, this is China, US, and India. So on a per capita basis, China is less than the US, but on a total volume basis, China is more than the US. One more graph. I don't want to just graph us to death on this, but here's the CO2 emissions, and that is per low, medium, and high income countries. This is the years. The gray line represents high income countries from 1960 on. The orange line represents medium income countries, and the blue line represents low-income countries. I assembled this graph from World Bank data because I wanted to show that there is a definite relationship between economic activity and CO2 emissions. So we didn't need COVID to tell us that. We could do it by looking at other things. This dip is believed to be when the Soviet Union and that area of the world had its economic downturn. Now, if I take this graph and I put the current COVID numbers, it should be down here, the 17% drop. In order to achieve pre-industrial levels, our 2050 target, according to Paris Accord, we'd have to be down here. Can you imagine the change in our economic activity that has to occur to go from here to here? That's a sobering thought. So, back to my orangutan friend. What makes humans so special that we can do this, that we can put so much carbon in the atmosphere from the past and basically upset the current carbon cycle? A lot believe it's because we no longer recognize our relationship with nature. But going back to the video, which we just had in a minute ago, and just unfortunately, I just accidentally did something to my screen here. There we go. I'm going to put everything out here so I don't lose you. Here we are. Migration was easy when we were hunters and gatherers. You just pull up stakes and move. Now we have these huge cities. We can't just move cities. I think one of the figures they put out in the drawing was that we want to protect a place like New York City because of rising sea levels. And I guess the estimate is that in the Netherlands, they spend about $50 billion per 250 miles of coastline to basically protect, to reinforce and hold off the sea level. Other options are to migrate. Obviously, I put this in here because this is an example of how we humans can separate ourselves from the environment, but it's almost technically impossible given our current understandings. So we have this delicate relationship between technology and the environment. Our technologies have enabled us to increase the carrying capacity of our environment, but as a result of that, we create a lot of greenhouse gases. And we're in what some people call a progress trap. It's not my term. It's a term that was actually, I think, made famous by Ronald Wright, but first coined in many years ago by a gentleman by the name of Daniel B. O'Leary. But what we mean by a progress trap is, it's as we develop a technology, it's a great thing. It fueled the development to make the world a better place over the last 50 to 100 years. But it had unintended consequences. In our case, as humans, the unintended consequences was the greenhouse gas emissions. And now we got this problem, we got to deal with it. Now, the Green New Deal is, as they mentioned in the video, just a resolution, a strategy to try and find ways to transition from a carbon-based economy to a renewable energy economy. I'm an optimist. I think this is possible, whether it comes in that shape of that deal, whatever. They mentioned nuclear fuel, nuclear power. They were talking fission, but if we ever are lucky enough to develop fusion, those banana peels I talked about would be enough energy to take a rocket to the moon and back if they were converted directly to pure energy, because the fusion is what goes on in the sun. We're a long way from that technology at this point. So back to my orangutan friend, perhaps humans are special. They're thinking now about doing some renewables. So if so, what are they going to do about this problem? So we have to really talk about the problem we're dealing with and what kind of problem it is. So I threw up this picture here, the guy on the ladder with a match going to light a bomb, and everybody else is running around trying to see what they can do to try and alleviate the mistake. Could I just check something a minute here? I want to make sure that, yeah, okay. There, everybody's running around trying to do something to stop this mistake. Some people are running away. Both these persons are running away. This guy, I don't know, maybe he's going to go up the ladder and try and knock him off, but it's difficult to comprehend the scope of the problem and the possible solutions. So Riddle and Weber suggested that we as humans are confronted with a lot of wicked problems, and I'm going to do justice to their concept by reading a short statement from them. The full consequences cannot be appraised until the waves of repercussions have completely run out, and we have no way of tracing all the waves through all the affected lives ahead of time or with a limited time span. And that's what we're up against with climate change. In fact, that prompted Levin to say that no, climate change isn't a wicked problem. It is a super wicked problem, and it has 4 key features. First of all, time is running out. I'll give you an example in a minute. Those who cause the problem also seek to provide a solution. So we're really part of the problem, and we can't fully understand it, and we're trying to solve it as a species across the globe. The central authority needed to address climate is weak or non-existent. So the UN is trying, but it's not really a strong central authority. It has to rely on values rather than enforcement. There's an irrational discounting occurs. It pushes the responses into the future. So we always come up with excuses. We don't want to hurt the economy and so on, and it pushes the problem to the future. So time is running out. And according to the UN Environmental Program, greenhouse gas emissions have increased at the rate of 1.5% per year this decade. And now we must reduce future emissions by 7.6% each year until 2030 to avert severe consequences. So clearly, now this number, it's kind of interesting that just as of today, I think it was in the Washington Post or New York Times, they mentioned that there's talk of 17% down because of COVID. That's probably not going to stay down there. I suspect that we're not going to be near this projection for this to catch up. These are some of the climate accords mediated by the UN since '82. And clearly, we've been trying along the way. I'm suggesting a three-pronged approach, which is a little different. I'm saying our first priority should be protect ecosystems, and our second priority along with that should be to price carbon. And third, to consume less. Now, protecting ecosystems and pricing carbon requires a socio-legal approach, and we are working on pricing carbon, and I'll talk about that in a few minutes. Protecting ecosystems can also be done. I mean, the Endangered Species Act indirectly protects ecosystems because when you protect a species, you have to do that by protecting its habitat. Consuming less, that's going to require a change in values, and I'll talk only briefly about that. Now, to make my point about ecosystems, I could have shown you a big forest burning and show that the deforestation is reducing our carbon sinks. Forests are a tremendous carbon sink. But I thought I would show you something that was a little more unusual, not thought of as a carbon sink. A whale is a carbon sink. So if you use the price of carbon, and when I say the price of carbon, I'm talking about the price that's necessary to mitigate the damages to build those seawalls and so on. Some economists have figured out how much a living whale is worth. In fact, Ralph Shammai and other macroeconomists made this first-of-kind calculation. They estimate at the price of carbon mitigation that a living whale is worth $2 million. Now, you might say, well, how can a whale be a carbon sink? Well, think of it this way. CO2 gets to the ocean, gets the plankton, particularly the phytoplankton, photosynthesize, and the whole food chain of the ocean continues, and the whale consumes a lot. A whale is a big, big animal. When it dies, it settles to the bottom of the ocean, becomes fixed, not entirely, but a good bit of it, into the ecosystem in the ocean, and there it is captured. So in a way, a whale is a living sink, a living carbon sink. Polly Higgins, who's no longer with us, called for the adoption of ecocide as a fifth peace crime to be governed by the International Criminal Court. So perhaps this is a way to start thinking about how we can protect our ecosystems by making it a crime to do certain things to them. I know whales are protected partly by, whaling is protected by the International Court, but for the most part, ecosystems are not. Now, pricing carbon is a different and more challenging thing, but it actually is probably the best way. This chart, which is a screenshot from a World Bank site, and lots of colors here, but the green, all the countries in dark green, I think it comes up to about 40 or 45, those countries already have in place carbon pricing of some sort. The other countries with the other colors are in progress towards that goal. The countries that are just sort of gray, they haven't done anything yet. Here we are. US, Africa, Russia, India. So far, the green countries, their checks on carbon emission accounts for about 20% of the total emissions, which is a good thing, but we have a long way to go. Unfortunately, and I don't need to stay much with this side, but the US has withdrawn or will withdraw. Right near the time the next election comes up, it'll be official, which is another whole topic for discussion. But fortunately, the states and the cities and so on are stepping up to the plate in the US and coming up with tremendous initiatives. In fact, the city of Reading is working on a climate action plan. Here's another, just something food for thought. This is about a year ago. There was an effort to put forth the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act. It's still not dead. It's supposed to be bipartisan, but it's got many, many more Democrats on it than it does Republicans. But if you look at what it says here, this is what it does. It puts a fees on carbon content of fuels, and those fees will be deposited into a carbon dividend trust fund and then used for administrative expenses and dividend payments to US citizens. Now, this is a little different. And what's good about this, I remember at a presentation in Chile talking about carbon taxes, and I got pushback because a lot of people are concerned that carbon taxes puts an undue burden on those that are least able to pay. Let's face it, a carbon tax, more than likely most of us we can afford to pay the carbon tax on more expensive fuels. But those that are living paycheck to paycheck or in a really marginalized community can't do that. With this particular model, the dividend payment to US citizens is the same whether you're a big consumer or a low consumer. So the point is, if you are a large consumer of carbon, and you will get the same size dividend check as everyone else, so you will be bearing a greater part of the burden. And generally, those with more ability to pay buy more products that consume carbon. So the idea is it's not just a way to change the direction of controlling carbon emissions and providing incentives for green fuels, but it also works to address some of the social injustice issues. Now, finally, I'm going to get to the values piece. I have 2 more slides here. I didn't check my time, but teenagers, it makes me think of Greta Thunberg. I'll never forget her presentation to the UN, that emotional appeal from a young woman. A survey by the Washington Post Kaiser Family Foundation said that 86% of the teenagers believe human activity has caused climate change. 24% have protested or emailed a government official concerning change, which I think is pretty good. But this is what really disturbs me. For other things, the percent that felt afraid, 57, motivated, 54, but 52% were angry. And then many felt helpless, guilty. Only about 20 were uninterested. The angry one really reminds us of Greta Thunberg's speech to the UN, because it was a passionate appeal for us to take action. One last slide, and I always include Ecuador in my conversations here, because about 2008 or so, Ecuador adopted a new constitution. And in their new constitution, Article 72, they recognize Pachamama as having constitutional rights. Pachamama is Quechua for Mother Earth. Can you imagine a constitution which is basically by people, for people, including Mother Nature as having rights? So then the question came, well, how can anyone even represent Mother Nature to the highest court in the land? The only way you can do that is by having some way of showing that she's been harmed. Well, they were shrewd enough to include in that constitutional article that she is an ecosystem. So then you could get the experts in to talk about how ecosystems were damaged if you want to represent her to the highest court in the land. Ecuador has an indigenous population of over 50%, so it's not too hard to see how that kind of a item could be put into the Constitution. Here in the United States, for example, we have the Endangered Species Act, which is a very strong way of protecting habitats. So for Ecuador, the constitutional approach was the best way because it's a way of statement of values, where in developed countries, we can rely on legislation that's developed to do it for us as well. But either way, it requires a change in values, a desire to protect nature. Because if we protect our ecosystems and we don't overload our carbon cycle, then we're going to better be able to avert this crisis. It's going to take some pretty shrewd policymaking, though, to do it. And this is my last slide. I drew this picture of this bug on a branch, and I always use a 6-word story in the Hemingway's tradition. So this is on the edge and nowhere to go. And that is the end of my talk, and I would really like to take questions, and I thank everyone for listening.
Excellent presentation, Dr. Stober. Thank you very much for sharing that with us. There's clearly a lot of interest in this topic. We've had more than 50 people join between Zoom here and Facebook Live, and we've got a couple of questions that came in through the chat here. Let me stop your screen sharing so we get your video back.
Oh, I'm sorry. Did I stop? Oh, I'm sorry.
I'll just grab it here.
I got it.
All right, all set. Okay, so let me kind of start just as the order they came in. Carla Mannix had asked, we know during your presentation you marked 2030 as kind of a target year for hitting some of these goals. What is the temperature or rate of rise that makes that the goal, and is there kind of a tipping point or a Rubicon that we won't be able to recover from?
Did you say the 230 or 250?
2030. Well, I heard
Either
you
one.
Either one. To achieve a certain level by 2050, but then I thought you had also said that 2030 was a goal date to have some of this implemented.
Right. Where the goal comes from is that the goal is to get to a level that is below industrial levels. And then it's just a matter of extrapolation to see how much of a percent reduction do we have to have each year to achieve that. So it came out initially with the first Paris Accord, or when the first goal was set, of about 1.5% per year. So each year we don't achieve that, then we have to achieve a greater percentage in next year's, and that's how that works.
Okay. And do you see, like, clearly a lot of factors. Do you see this primarily as a political issue, an economic issue, a technological issue? What's going to be the spear, the tip of the spear that gets us moving towards a solution here, do you think?
Oh, that's a really good question. There's a couple. I would actually say it's all of the above. I think that I think the political will actually is improving. It's improving quite a bit globally. And I think that even though we withdrew from the Paris Accord, at least planned to withdraw officially, I think that there are a lot of states that are moving in the right directions. And I think that there will eventually be incentives of some sort to promote the development of greenhouse gas, or of renewable technologies, because it'll actually pay to do the right thing in this respect, because as companies become liable for like, you take some of the big companies like ExxonMobil and so on, as they become more liable for things through the legal system, it's going to pay them to take precautions. But actually, ExxonMobil came out of the Paris Accord and made the statement that they are in favor of a carbon tax. The best way to do this is to basically put in a disincentive on carbon production.
Yeah, has the COVID crisis kind of broken through the denier or hoaxer arguments in any way? It seems difficult to deny that the decrease in human activity hasn't had a significant impact on the decrease in pollution.
I absolutely agree. I think that, that one graph I showed where I said that when you had the Soviet Union break up and there was a dip in the carbon emissions because of the economic disconnect, there was also a disconnect with a reduction in carbon in the last financial crisis in the world, 2008 or so. But this COVID disconnect, this really demonstrates it. This is almost like a big experiment. And can I expand just briefly on that? When I was talking about carrying capacity of an environment, one of the things that reduces carrying capacity is if your wastes accumulate. And CO2 is a waste product if it overloads the carbon cycle. But there's another factor. It's called density-dependent disease. And COVID really is a good example of a density-dependent disease. And so I think humanity needs to stand up and take notice of this, what's going on here. So, but there's absolutely no doubt that there's a connection between economic activity and, pardon me?
Any sign that side of the argument is breaking through, having any impact on the people who aren't already on board with that?
I don't have any empirical evidence to that. In fact, I think the fact that I think it's going to go back to business as usual, economically speaking. But I'm speaking for myself and not for my institution now. My hope is that the next election cycle will put us in a position where we start to pay more attention to the new Green Deal and ideas related to renewables. Without a change in the current administration, it won't happen too easily.
Yeah. Okay, so Scott Case, who was on the presentation, he's actually facilitating a climate change meeting for the city of Reading at 1 o'clock, so he had to leave early. But his question was, what are the ways one can increase economic activity while drastically decreasing CO2 emissions? They're sometimes presented as conflicting goals, but are there ways to decarbonize economic activity that we should be looking at?
Yes, absolutely. This is one of the primary arguments of the Green New Deal resolution that the jobs that are in coal and oil and gas, those jobs have transferable skills, and we can retool our workforce to be involved with production of renewables. The truth of the matter is the challenge is that there will be some that, because they will be displaced, but if they can have opportunity to redevelop and become part of the green technologies, there's no reason we should have a problem. That's the role of the educational institutions and incentives from, and that's why we need the carbon tax, or at least the carbon dividend, or something that causes us to be able to have an incentive for people to go green rather than continue to burn coal and oil and gas.
Yeah, and as a consumable resource with a finite supply, they'd be forced into that at some point, you'd think, anyway.
Yeah, I think that what gets a lot of us concerned is that, yeah, do you hear me?
Yes, let's keep forging ahead.
Okay, I'm sorry if my voice, I should be okay, I'm hardwired here. But I could turn my video off if I lose too much, if you lose me. But, well, I guess I'll go to the next question. I got kind of disconnected there.
Okay. Randy Noonan from Penn State University says, renewables are becoming much cheaper. I heard that the percent of US electricity generated by renewables is now higher than the percentage from coal. Can innovation and the free market save us, even without big government action?
That's a true statement, and I think there's a possibility of that. I don't know that it's by design, though. I think it's because of our inability to be united globally and nationally to come up with policies. I think in the long term, renewables are going to be the choice because of change in values, and that's the significant part. You know, we saw, I teach in a college setting, and of course I don't get to work with teenagers, but I think there's a real change in attitudes, and I think those attitudes are going to spill over into different kinds of actions on the part of consumers. Hybrid electric vehicles are a good example. Now I know that some of the naysayers say that electric vehicles, if you're making electricity by coal, you primarily have a coal burning car, but by adopting hybrids, there's a change in values being expressed, and there is a transition away from burning coal for electricity, and ultimately this will be a slow process, but I believe it could occur. It will occur, I think, without government intervention. Now, I would personally like to see more government intervention, but I think it'll occur without, because ultimately, if we don't meet the objectives, if you remember that one chart when I said how far down we have to go to avoid the catastrophic effects that are associated with being above those pre-industrial levels, we're going to have, I mean, if I start listing off the list, it gets to be depressing, but sea level rise is just one of the problems. You've got seawater going in underneath, and then you'll have coastlines that'll have seawater in the soil, which will affect plants. You've got changes in climate, which is going to cause pests and diseases to migrate to different areas. People are going to be displaced. We're going to have agricultural systems that don't function properly, and the list goes on and on. Tremendous storms. I don't think we have the ability, this is why it's a wicked problem, I don't think we have the ability to comprehend the magnitude of the effects of not getting those gases down. So if we don't get the gases down and we're always behind the curve, we're going to soon find out that the expenses associated with sea level problems, the expenses associated with disease spreading, the expenses associated with having to ship our foods from regions where they're produced where they weren't produced before, and the migration issues, I think they'll be so expensive that they're going to force us into taking the steps to do green technologies. And maybe not, maybe we'll have an economic collapse. The question is, which is more resilient, the natural systems or the social systems? And the social systems probably aren't as resilient as the natural systems. And once it breaks down, then economic activity will break down. That's a morbid thought.
Yeah,
but then
sounds like
what
kind
will
of a race
emerge?
to the end at that point.
Yeah.
So
can't
Carla,
rule
who
that
asked a
out,
question
though.
earlier, though, raises the point that it's, sorry, I think I missed that last part. But I'll just move on. Carla, who asked a question earlier, raises the point that it's going to cost us energy to execute this transition. We'll be still, fossil fuel driven to build the solar panels and factories. Is that enough of an offsetting cost, or will we see kind of a spike to get you to that point?
Oh, that's an excellent question. And first, before I give the right answer to it, or what I think is a good answer to it, if you just put in an infrastructure, some kind of energy system that is dependent on gas, for example, it doesn't make sense to just throw it out, because when you throw a system out, you're actually throwing out a lot of energy that went into developing the system. That's why the cap and trade ideas are pretty good, because the idea that everyone has so many credits, and those that are able to get to be more efficient soon can then sell those credits to someone else to become efficient, but they can become efficient a little later on. That way companies and industries are able to run through the useful life cycle of a piece of equipment. For example, it doesn't, and to put it in a consumer's point of view, if I have an old car, or let's say I just bought a new gas car, for me to throw that out and buy an electric car is kind of counterproductive, because it took a lot of energy to get that car built. We're better off making it so that the transition is over a period of time so that we can use up infrastructure that still has some useful life. And that's a very delicate balance. It takes planning, it takes good incentives on the part of policymakers to make the tax laws and such so that it addresses that. This is why it's so complicated, but I hope that point was clear that I made there. So I'm not talking about just throwing out all the old systems. I'm saying let's transition.
And certainly as that becomes the more affordable option for businesses, that's the path they'll go. They're more interested in making money than they are in preserving the fossil fuel industry, I'm sure. So another kind of economic question, and this may be tough to answer. John Fleming asked what segment of the economy is likely to have been hit the hardest coming out of this. I think as he mentioned, the airlines are a fairly visible, dramatic example. Do you have any sense of how we're going to come out of this, or what industries might not come out of this?
Well, first of all, I'm not an economist, but it's obvious that from what I've read, the bulk of the reduction in greenhouse gas emissions because of COVID have been obviously in the transportation sector, both in terms of trucking, autos, and of course, flying. Now, coming out of COVID, if we go back to business as usual, then it'll be business as usual. But if we adopt some new ways of doing business, such as more of these kinds of things, Zoom, less conferences, traveling all over the world. I mean, I talk about sustainability, and I've traveled to almost 50 countries. The question is that really sustainable? And maybe we need to think in terms of not doing many things by going there in person. And airlines are going to be really impacted. I think they're going to be the most impacted by this. Now, there are some efforts to develop, there are experimental electric planes, believe it or not, on a very small scale, usually just one passenger, two passenger. The question is, can we get a plane up in the air and do it without fossil fuels? Probably we could do it with different kinds of liquid fuels. But I think that in the transition, I think we're going to see airlines, because of COVID partly, going to having fewer passengers and fewer flights that are less dense and fewer flights. So I think the transportation industry for planes is going to be a tough return, but I think it will be a return. And is it going to be painful? Well, what's good about, if there's anything good about this, it's causing us to reflect on our consumption and our patterns of doing business. And maybe that'll make a difference. But again, that's all speculation at this point.
Yeah, it seems like in a
maybe
couple
wishful
areas there
thinking.
could be some positive lessons learned, hopefully, on the tail end of this. So I'm going to try and wrap this up on a question of my own. I was really interested in your whale analogy. I appreciate that more creative approach instead of just going with the traditional rainforest. So what I took away from the way you described that is that it essentially costs the world $2 million for a whale to exist and die. So it is in our interest to keep as many of them as dying from possible. Is that the main takeaway there?
Oh, no, I guess I didn't. A whale is worth that much money if it grows from birth to full size and then dies. In other words, as the whale grows, it consumes carbon. It's a carbon sink. So any carbon that it can pick up is less carbon in the air. And then it goes, so basically if you take the price of what it is to mitigate carbon, if it's $20 a ton to mitigate carbon, then you can use that to extrapolate as to what the whale is worth as a carbon sink. Basically, every time you plant a tree, and we plant trees and forests, we're planting carbon sinks. Yeah, actually, every time you make plastic, you have a carbon sink. Because plastic is
So
basically
nature knows what it's doing, I guess, is the lesson there.
Nature knows what it's doing. Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Stober.
Yeah.
I'm going to turn the meeting over to Lynn for some closing words.
Thank you, everyone.
Do we still have Lynn?
I am back.
There we go.
It went out and I'm back. Where are we, Mike?
We're wrapping up the meeting, so the show is yours. Although it looks like Lynn may be having some trouble here today too.
I think she's frozen.
All right, well, I will try to cover. I didn't necessarily have anything prepared for this portion of the meeting, but again, I appreciate everybody joining. This has been spectacular. One of our heaviest attended meetings yet. The recordings for all the past meetings are available, like I said, on our YouTube channel and our Facebook page, Whack Reading, on both platforms. Thank you so much, Dr. Stober, for delivering this presentation. I think our members got a lot out of it based on the high quality questions that we received. And I will just try to check the upcoming schedule here. I know next Wednesday, the 27th at noon, we've got India and Pakistan with Dr. Sudeep Ghosh. Then I think the Wednesday following that, Red Sea Security with Dr. Fegley. And then the Wednesday after that, another noon presentation on infectious disease, including COVID-19. So we've got some rapid fire presentations here. This is our third in a row on Wednesdays. We're going to have, there's an alternating between noon and 7 p.m. So keep an eye out for the Constant Contact email newsletter to find out when those presentations are. We will keep these going. I know we've got some membership stuff going on. We've got some survey stuff going on. So check your newsletters. Thanks again so much for joining. Thanks to everybody on Facebook. Thanks to our members on Zoom. And we will see everyone again next week. Thanks.